Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Honestly Let's Talk. I'm your host, Todd Nesloni, and I have so loved bringing you a variety of conversations in this new little branch off of Tell Your Story called Honestly Let's Talk. These are live every Thursday, so if you're joining me live, thank you. If you're joining on the podcast later, I'm so glad you're here. Now, I am thrilled to have my special guest today, Joe. I have interacted with Joe before, and he is a wealth of knowledge, a boundary pusher, and he lays it out like it is. And I love having those people in my circle. Joe, thanks for being here. Kind of introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks, Todd. Nice to connect. I think we connected about a year ago, plus or minus. So always nice to reconnect. I'm Joe. I am a principal of a middle school, but I also am a father of two, soon to be three. I often tell people that's my real job. One is all whatever else I'm supposed to be doing, but I really just take care of my kids, especially being at home. I also do a bunch of racial equity coaching and consulting, and I used to do more writing. Now I do a lot more adult learning and professional development. And yeah, I love to create, love doing that work. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled you are here for this conversation today. And so we wanted to talk about, putting anti-racism into practice and policy because, especially during the days we're living in now, there's a lot of talk about things, but not always a lot of action when it comes. And so before we even get started, kind of talk to me a little bit about your background in this and why this is so important to you.
Yes, I think my background primarily is being a student, right? Any student who's been through this educational system knows the beauty of it and a lot more stories around things that weren't working, whether that means you just had a really mean teacher, right? Or someone who said microaggressions to you or was racist to you and had that experience for that matter. So that's my primary experience, right? That I brought into being an educator. And then as an educator, I have to sit with this idea of what am I going to do that's better than that, right? If now I'm on the other side, how am I going to teach better? How am I going to center kids? How am I going to really love them and care for them? And that led me to leadership, right? And then that led me to, okay, well, I'm figuring some things out at my school. Then we've kind of hacked at some things and saw some success and learned some stuff and hit some pitfalls as well. How do I share those ideas out? And that started with writing and blogging, and then that led to doing like trainings and figuring how do I share these lessons that I've learned. And if I don't have the answers, like what question am I looking for, and let us explore that question together.
Joe, something that I've loved about you and following you is that, like I said in the intro, you tell it like it is. And for some people, that's really uncomfortable when they have to be faced with their own racism or biases or things like that. Was that a voice that you had to grow into, or has that always been kind of who you are?
I think it's something I feel like I started with because my dad is mom 100%, right? She is a very blunt, tell it like it is person, right? to everyone's, like frustration at times, right? So that was the beginning, right? And seeing that, and I think going through academia and you kind of make it through this obstacle course, right? This gauntlet of a process, you learn to not tell it like it is, because you learn that you're not supposed to question power. You're not supposed to push back. You're not supposed to upset the people who are making things happen, right? And you get more power when you do that, right? When you yield to power, you get more power, right? When you play the game, when you promote the status quo, that's when people give you more keys, right? To put on your ring to say, oh, now you get the keys to the whole building. Now you can be a superintendent because we've trusted that you're not really going to do anything too crazy, right? So we can trust you, right? Going through, I realized that the more I was honest with folks, the more direct I was, the more provocative I was, then we could actually have like some real conversations. So as I explored being honest and explored being blunt and explicit, I saw results, right? I saw the people react in that way to say like, oh my God, like you're actually sharing what I'm thinking that I didn't know we were allowed to actually say. Like, I didn't know you could actually say, fuck that, right? It's like, you could say that, right? If that's how you're feeling, right? You may not say that to a person and tear a person down, right? But to say that things aren't working, we need to say that, right? And the more I've done that, the more I was sharing this somewhere else recently, that I've gotten in touch with who I am as a person again, right? Because like I said, like you go through school, they teach you how to write, what to say, what the right grammar is, how to back up your perspectives. You can't use opinion; it has to be backed with the facts. But the facts have to be written by people who've written things, who've had the, you know what I mean? Like that whole thing, you just learned that you don't have a voice, right? Um, what I've learned recently is that when we upset that, um, somewhere else, right? So I've been loving that, right? And to be more specific, when we challenge white supremacy, if we're talking about racism, directly, explicitly, then we can do something about it. But when we talk all around the conversation, we're not having any conversation and we're not changing anything.
You know, I think you brought up a really great point there. Is, you know, we spend so much time talking around the conversation that's why things don't change. And so being a school leader, you know, and being so vocal and so out there, do you have pushback from the community, from teachers? Like, how do you still instigate change while making people uncomfortable? Because you and I both know that growth doesn't happen unless we are uncomfortable, which is why we don't have a problem pushing that conversation or doing that. But when you are doing that, like you just said, you're gonna get pushback. So what keeps you motivated to keep going, and how do you make that change happen in the midst of defiance?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just become more and more strategic, right? And that's not to say more scared, right? Because sometimes strategic means you just wait and you never do it. You never start. You never say the thing, right? But you become more strategic around what needs to be said first. What I learned is the more explicit, sometimes the less resistance, sometimes, right? Because this whole thing of what I've noticed is when we dip our toe in the water, right, and kind of just like test something, right, we still get resistance. we still get the same resistance when people know what's coming. They kind of know where it's going. They're like, I don't even know, you're not going to get an inch, right? But when we just say, I want the whole mile, now we can have a conversation about whether we deserve the mile or we don't, whether we should or we shouldn't. Then we can have a different kind of conversation. Is there resistance? Hell yeah, all the time, right? And the resistance gets just as crafty as our work to dismantle white supremacy or to dismantle patriarchy. It gets just as crafty, right? You got a YouTube channel where you talk about anti-racism. They got a YouTube channel where they're talking about racism, right? With their own backed up facts, with their own experts and whatnot. So like, we have to know that that's going to be a part of the process, because if we're ever challenging privilege, privilege doesn't want to yield, right? They don't want to give up their privilege. Like how long is it going to take men to give up patriarchy, right? A long fucking time, right? Similar, how long is it going to take white folks to give up white privilege? So it's going to come. We're just prepared for it. And like, if the question is, are you going to continue or not? You know, and the last thing I'll say about that is, I realized that it wasn't about me, right? So when I was trying to do this one person crusade to do this kind of work, it's easy to take out one person, right? It's easy to remove and discredit one person. But once you start building a team and it's like broad-based, this distributed leadership approach to change, then people have to push back against 5, 7, 8, 10 people. And then as a leader, I can just kind of step out, right? And like, even for me, as I'm transitioning out of being a school leader soon / one day, they have to continue that work without me, right? And if it's all on me, it's definitely can't sustain. And people think it's about me, as opposed to building the capacity and the mindset of that whole group of people.
Well, you know, and you said something really powerful there that resonated with me, and that is, when people are in places of power, they don't want to give it up. And so when you say things that are going to bring out the light of what's happening, it's going to make them uncomfortable and they're going to push back. And so, you know, how did that lead to you kind of beginning these trainings that you do? Because I haven't been able to attend one yet, but I'm so impressed by your work that it's on my plate to go to one. And so tell me a little bit about where that came from for you to build that side. And to those listening or watching, tell them kind of how they can get involved.
Yeah, well, you got an opportunity this summer, Todd. I'm gonna hit you up and tell you what's coming, and more after that if you can't make that. So how it led me there was, I just started realizing that there was some learning that I was having through the process around how to go about change, how to go about actually serving our kids who are not being served in our system. So as I reflected and just iterated my process through working just with my own staff, I started having these kind of meta moments of like, what exactly is happening here? Like, what am I doing? And it started with writing, right? And I was like, oh, wow, like I could share these ideas, right? And people were like, oh, I really like this idea. And then I thought of like, well, how do I train people and set people up to do this, right? And that led me to doing some small workshops. Then I started my full day foundational, this man white supremacy culture in schools workshop. I did a whole summer thing last summer, and then I followed up since then with like topics on microaggressions, project-based learning, interrupting racism, teaching and leadership, right? So for me, I'm trying to solve these, this Rubik's Cube, right, that we've all been trying to solve for decades.
Well, what I love about your class, and the reason I haven't had a chance to sign up yet, is that when you advertise them and people go to sign up, you're like, you have to be there. Like, this isn't I can watch the recording later. It's like, no, this is an interactive. You're part of the conversation. You're part of the change. And I love that, because I think that's a piece that's missing, is people want to go and say, just feed me, tell me what I need to do, but then they don't want to be present for the conversation. And that's why it's like, I didn't want to sign up, because it's like, I want to make sure I can be present and able to be there the whole time. And so was that a very cognizant decision of yours, that you're like, that has to be a point?
Yeah. I mean, when we did it in real, in person, you gotta be there, right? And when you're in person, you're talking to people, you're having conversation, right? You're walking around the room, writing on the post-it notes around the walls, right? Like, so that's how learning should be, right? Now, if we're going to do it virtual, then how are you going to do that, right, and not be there? And a lot of people do like recorded webinars and self-paced lessons or whatever. For me, it's about the people, and it's about connecting with the people, right? And it's about the people seeing each other, right? And me kind of feeling their vibe and having conversation. Like, every time I do a workshop, we probably spend 30, 40, sometimes an hour and a half in the summer after the workshop, just having a conversation, just having a Q&A after the workshop, right? And like, that's almost more important and more valuable than the actual workshop, because that's when we get into the nitty gritty. But yeah, you got to be there, man. It's interactive. Life is happening. You can't just get the handouts. We were just, can I get the handouts? Can I get the handouts? It was like, no, man, it's not a handout. Life's not a handout.
I love it. I love it. Well, Joe, this conversation today was titled Putting Anti-Racism into Policy and Practice. And so I know there's educators who are listening today who are thinking, okay, Joe, I agree with you, but I'm in a really rural area. The beliefs are very different here. I want to get the conversation started, but I have to be careful so I don't lose my job, kind of thing. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts. One is the advice piece, and then what does anti-racism in practice actually mean? So I think the advice is you can't go alone, right? Right. This David and Goliath approach. Goliath is winning usually, right? Okay. Right. The real story nowadays is the house wins. Okay. When it's one on a system, right? So people have to build their team, right? They have to build a broad base. They got to organize, right? I mean, all of our human rights and civil rights efforts throughout the years, it's with one person fighting their boss, right? It was like, no, we're going to organize and educate people and picket and do petitions and all this kind of stuff and educate folks to then fight for some change, right? So that piece of this kind of community organizing approach must go hand in hand with like this inside the system kind of piece. And a lot of times I tell people like, and if none of that is working, you can leave, right? Like there are kids everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That need you, right? And if a place is so toxic that like you could take your skills and your drive and your passion somewhere else that can appreciate you a little bit more. And the last thing I'll say about this is everybody's wondering where the other person is at because we're all in hiding, right? But once someone kind of comes up and waves that flag and I'm like, no, over here, join the fight, right? That might be that first person, right? And people will find you, right? They're all doing the same thing. And then more people come, like that's, you just got to build a movement wherever you are.
I love that you said just build a movement wherever you are. And then if it's that toxic, leave. I think that was great advice. I mean, I think you also said something really powerful there about, there will be other people who are just as nervous to say something. And if you at least bring it up, you might find an ally that you didn't know you had before that. So that's great advice. Well, Joe, you've done a lot of work at your own school with putting these things into practice. What's one of the really valuable pieces that you've put in place at your school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as I reflect now, like on 6 years, at the school I've been at, I think the biggest change has been blowing up the Bell schedule, master schedule. The biggest, because once you change time and space, different things can happen, right? And when we blow our schedule, we had a regular schedule before that, right? 6 periods in a day, teachers come early, collaboration was like 40 minutes Monday through Friday every day. That was it. And maybe one day was like 80 minutes or something, right? We blew it up and said, we're going to go all at once. We did block scheduling. Only 3 classes meet 3 times a week, a modified block schedule, if you're familiar with that. Kids go home early 2 days a week, and staff have now 2-hour chunks of professional learning on 2 afternoons, right? So I think our last one before pandemic was Tuesday and Friday. Kids go home, and now we can get busy, right? Whether that is all together, departments, PLCs, or grade level teams, or whatever that is. But at some point, we can bring people together and have a 2-hour meeting. As often as, like at a certain point, as a leader, I had to step back and say, it's not going to be our show, my show all the time. Then it was, what are we going to do with this time that's going to move our school forward, right? So we did that, and we added reading intervention for all kids, and we added new electives into the class, right? All together, right? And we added PBL the same year, right? So now with those things, right, is we can entertain and explore how to do professional learning with time, with a block schedule, right? Whereas you can't do that. We can talk about how we stop being so racist and punitive in our approach to discipline when we have time to actually sit down and just actually fucking talk to each other, right? But when you're in between running meeting to meeting to meeting, in and out so quickly, how can you ever get so deep? And you can't pick up these deep conversations like racial identity and racial bias and racism and anti-racism in 40 minutes. That's why it didn't happen, because there wasn't even enough time for it. So like, that's revolutionary, right? To change the space and time, because then kids have a different experience. Now they have access to electives. Now they have access to reading intervention. Now they're actually reading closer to grade level than they were before, being 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 grade levels behind, right? So huge, right? Huge.
I love it. I think that's so, it's so, it would push so many people out of their comfort zone, but it really makes a difference. And I love that you have the proof to back it up. I mean, that's always the best thing. Well, Joe, as we wrap this conversation up today, I always love to end kind of with the same question, as that is, people are going to walk away with all kinds of stuff from this conversation, but if they only walk away with one thing, what one thing do you want them to walk away with?
I think you have to be willing to own your privilege and use your privilege, right? To make space for folks that don't have that privilege, to just live a regular life, for students to have a joyful kind of life. But it comes down to us recognizing the privilege that we hold, whether that is a privilege of whiteness or being a man, or having an education, a degree on paper, right? Or having a position, right? And decentering our needs and our comforts for the justice that's required, So it's always about privilege, right? And oftentimes about white privilege in our country.
Well, Joe, I appreciate you, and I can't wait to go back and rewatch this episode, because there's so much for me to digest already in the things that you've said. I greatly appreciate your input, your ideas, and I'm thankful for everybody who listened and joined in on this episode of Honestly Let's Talk. You can check out brand new episodes every Thursday live at 8 p.m. Central on my Facebook page, or you can check out all the recordings on the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you get your stuff, it's there. Hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Joe, and we'll see you next week.